Katherine, shall we start with you then? Because I think almost a decade ago now, in 2015, you wrote that while medical science was getting better and better, there were aspects of death and dying that were getting worse. Does that still hold true today?
The situation is that there have been improvements, there have been progress in palliative and end-of-life care over the past 10 years. But the thing that worries me is that the rate of progress has not been enough to keep up with the increase in need for palliative care.
Yeah, because we've got this ageing population. Yeah. You're suggesting that people are getting not just older, but sicker as well.
Exactly. So we know that roughly about 3/4 of people who die would benefit from some kind of palliative care before they die, not necessarily care provided by specialists, like palliative care specialists like me, but perhaps palliative care provided by a GP or a district nurse. So about 75% of people who die would benefit from palliative care, but there's a really big gap between the number of people who need palliative care and the number of people who get it. Hospice UK estimated a few years ago that in the UK each year, more than 100,000 people die needing palliative care but not getting it. But we also know that need for palliative care is going up because of ageing, because of multiple long-term conditions and complexity. And what that means is that unless services get better as well in parallel with that increase, then the gap between those who need palliative care and those who get it is going to increase. And certainly speaking from a clinical perspective, in my clinical practice, every day I see examples where I think palliative care has been provided too late or not at all. So people, I work in an acute hospital, people who have pain that is far from well enough controlled, people who haven't even had the opportunity to talk about what's important to them, and people, for example, with severe existential distress where no one's really had the time to sit down and try and unpick that with them. So while aspects of palliative care are improving and there has been progress, I do worry that the rate of progress has simply not been enough to keep up with the increase in needs.
Nancy, is that a picture you recognise?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very much what we would recognise. I think there's also a lack of awareness of the benefits of palliative care in the wider healthcare system. So that's partly why people refer late. And I think there's almost an element of it being the cherry on the cake, something nice if you can do it. Whereas actually it's integral to everybody's experience of death and dying. And it shouldn't be reliant on whether people know about palliative care. We did a review of the literature and we found one of the big issues was people didn't always trust palliative care. Say oncologists, they didn't know the benefits of palliative care. They thought it was just pain control. It's much more than that. And so they didn't know when to refer or how to refer or to run systems in parallel. So a lot of the work we do is about training up and developing services that integrate palliative care into what we call generalist palliative care. So working with, say, respiratory teams or heart failure teams so that they can manage a lot of this and then refer on to specialist palliative care when it's needed.
I mean, Nancy, how much of this about finance? You spoke to a select committee a while ago, and I think you said that 75% is funded from tombolas. Is that an exaggeration? It sounds like this extraordinary figure.
Well, it's kind of how well your tombola went. So it's hugely reliant on community funding. And so, it's far less comes from the NHS. I mean, there's benefits to that because it gives the hospice movement and palliative care some autonomy. But if you go into most hospitals, there won't be palliative care beds, whereas there might be in other countries. It's almost, as I said, it's kind of like an extra. But if within the hospice community, we're now starting to hit real issues with the first crises in that maybe paediatric palliative care, services are going to go under. And people need to start thinking, how important is palliative care? And if it's really that important, surely we should have a much better funding system.
I mean, Katherine, how does this fit into this conversation that politicians are about to have about assisted dying? Can the two be separated? Can you have a conversation about assisted dying without acknowledging these problems that you both talk about?
I used to keep a sort of mental track of the hospices that were closing because of lack of funds, and I've just given up because it's happening more and more frequently. And I think it's an interesting thought experiment. Would we accept this situation in any other aspect of health or care? Can you imagine someone saying, I'm sorry, we can't deliver your baby today because not enough people have done fun runs? Can you imagine someone saying, well, you can't have your dialysis until next week because not enough bric-a-brac has been donated? Why is it that we accept this situation because people are dying? Just because care of the dying isn't high tech, it doesn't mean it should therefore be low priority.
When you put it in those terms, it is extraordinary that bric-a-brac and fun runs and tombolas are controlling this very important part of people's lives, because death is obviously a part of life. I mean, we're now having this conversation about assisted dying. Is it possible for politicians to have that conversation while this is all happening, this situation that you both described?
I mean, it's possible for them to do it, but they shouldn't. It would be very, very unwise. What I hear more and more is a sort of bland platitudes about palliative care. Well, of course, we must improve palliative care, but bland platitudes are not enough. What are we actually doing to improve palliative and end-of-life care? There is a real possibility that if an assisted dying law comes in, people will be nudged towards an assisted death simply because they can't get the health and care that they need. We did a poll that came out last week, and we found that 59% of the public said they were worried that people might feel pressured into an assisted death. Me too. I'm worried about that. And I think it's, well, at best naive to say that the decision to have an assisted death would never be influenced by external pressure. Of course, for some people it will be. And I think we need to think about what that external pressure might be. Yes, it might be another person, a family member who wants to get their hands on the inheritance. That's the sort of thing the sort of picture that's painted. But actually that external pressure might be the system. It might be the health and care system that can't provide that person with what they need. So we separate the discussion about assisted dying from the discussion about palliative care at our peril. They are absolutely intimately connected.
Nancy, do you think that pressure could be implicit? It could come from the circumstances surrounding people?
I think it's implicit, but I think, as Katherine said, that the two do go together. But I think some of these arguments are not just about death and dying. And I think death and dying has been hijacked by assisted dying. It's about, for a lot of people, unbearable suffering. And unbearable suffering isn't just at the end of life. And it's very easy to use dying as almost a scare tactic to say this is the issue. And in other countries, they've expanded this. And they've said, well, actually, unbearable suffering is mental health. It's other conditions. It's much more upstream in life. We're all terminal. We all might choose how we want to live. So by keeping this argument just in palliative care is actually not as maybe as upfront as what the decisions and discussions about assisted dying really are about. And I think most people in favour of assisted dying, they are particularly in favour of the right to choose when they want to end their life. And that could be for a variety of reasons around unbearable suffering. But it's easier to talk about death and dying. And then we come into this kind of strange scenario where palliative care is put up against assisted dying, where actually it's not, if we had more funding and better access to palliative care, that would be great. I don't think would stop the discussion around assisted dying, because it's often about how people are choosing to live for quite long periods of time before we're talking about dying.
I mean, you talk about those conversations there, Nancy. Are you suggesting that patients and families just don't want to discuss it, that even though it's happening and it's known that there is a sort of path that people are on, it's not necessarily something that we talk about?
I think people do want to talk about it, and I think they do bring it up, and they don't always bring it up as clearly as I want to go to Dignitas. But we do interviews. We've done interviews with people in this country where they're quite often people have a conversation, what we call about hastened death. What we do know from research in Spain is if you have that conversation and you then open that conversation to demystify what death and dying is about, people are far less likely to choose an assisted death. A lot of this is about fear of the unknown. You might have experienced an awful death. We know that does happen, but actually that might not be the death that's your death. So if you talk to a specialist, they can talk you through this and they can talk about what palliative care can offer. And that's really down the far end of the palliative care trajectory.
I mean, We're talking about an end-of-life decision here and the complexities involved for patients and families, but this is also a question for healthcare workers as well. And Katherine, I wanted to talk to you about that. I mean, you work in palliative care. We've heard from people in Oregon and places where assisted dying is allowed that there have been concerns from healthcare workers that it changes the dynamic and the role. Is that something that you're aware of?
I mean, I've certainly seen those studies, and I've spoken to colleagues working abroad who express some of those things. I mean, some people working in palliative care who are part of delivering assisted dying feel that things are working okay. Some people in palliative care feel that things that aren't working okay. So there's a range of views. 80%, I think, of palliative care doctors in this country are against assisted dying. It's lower for other specialists. The closest to palliative care, I think, is geriatricians. There's a really interesting question about why it is that palliative care doctors in particular are particularly against assisted dying.
Do you have any insight into why that might be?
I think it's because in palliative care, we work every day with people who are not only deteriorating and dying, but at their most vulnerable. The patients I see, many are old, many are quite frail. They may have fluctuating capacity, but they all have good days and bad days. They all have moments of despair and moments of hope. And I think that we see that vulnerability every day in palliative care. Similarly with geriatricians, I think, a very similar kind of patient cohort, whereas other types of medical professional are, I guess, are far less exposed to those kind of issues. That's my sense of why that difference exists.
Nancy, I think you've done some research into this in the Netherlands and places where assisted dying is legal.
Yeah, so even for people who are in favour, there can be limits as to what they will do. And they always talk about this is never a normal death. So it can be something they totally understand somebody wants and they're supportive of that decision. And for some people, they can manage to do multiple assisted deaths. Other people will say, well, actually, I can only manage about once a year and then I can get myself back into it and do it again. Other people said they moved away from that area of practice. So this is a real worry I think I have, that within palliative care, if doctors start moving out because they feel that they don't want to be faced with these conversations, and some people might be conflicted for religious reasons as well, then that's a real worry for the system. So quite often what happens is, particularly in places like Canada, you end up with teams of almost volunteer doctors who are doing this, and it's not your team. And I think that's probably one of the biggest misunderstandings we have. Even in the Netherlands, it's often not your doctor who is administering the euthanasia. It's somebody else within the wider team who's prepared to do this. And then it's very unusual in healthcare that they'll often say, well, do you want to take the afternoon off? Have you got support for later? Do you need a glass of wine? And that's really different, and the way staff talk about it. So there is a real impact on healthcare staff, and we need to be really careful. If we do change the law, we need to really support the healthcare staff who are involved.
We've talked about the lack of provision, the lack of funding, the lack of conversation, the concerns from staff themselves. I mean, bearing in mind all of those things, is the UK equipped to be potentially having these conversations about a bill being introduced anytime soon?
It's not just important about whether it should be, but how it would be. And I think unless we actually address the how, my biggest fear is they will make a decision and it will be just based on an assumption this will become part of the NHS. And we don't know if that is even possible and implementable. We've had big issues in the past with palliative care pathways at the end of life. Do we want another problem where we have a poor implementation of what something looks good but actually hasn't got enough evidence behind it? And is it safer to take this out of healthcare, which they've done in Austria? It's largely out of healthcare in Switzerland. So you can have a panel who really looks at should this happen or not. And that panel is looking both prospectively and retrospectively to say, were the safeguards in place? Did we get this right? Did we get this wrong? What can we learn for it? Putting into the NHS, which the government is even describing as broken, how do you do that right now? And even worse than that, if the message is on the NHS you can get assisted dying, but you have to rely on community funding for palliative care, that's a bit shocking, really.
I think that there's such a tendency for this debate to just become reduced to binary arguments. Is this morally okay? Yes or no? And we have to move on from that. We have to talk about some of the complexities here, the practical implication. We hear this phrase all the time, with appropriate safeguards. Yes, I think we should legalise assisted dying with appropriate safeguards. And what I would like to understand is which safeguards are actually appropriate, how safe are they, and how safe is safe enough for us as a society, because we know that no safeguards can be 100% safe. So what level of safety would we as a society find acceptable? And that to me is the kind of really knotty, uncomfortable question that we have to be asking now rather than after the House of Commons has voted, yes, we must have this, and then start to think about these difficult questions.
Because I suppose if the House of Commons votes, yes, we should have assisted dying, it's potentially then years and years of meetings and committees and who's responsible and who's putting in those safeguards and which groups of people are responsible for those safeguards. Do we need to train everything in community groups, for example? That's what you're suggesting here.
I think we need to have those conversations now.